them through. Go ahead. Say what? You know, somebody wanted to talk about the New Jersey plan, but we haven't addressed it yet. What's the difference between the two plans, Virginia and New Jersey?
Virginia plan was based on population for representation.
Yeah, one of the first debates that they had when they were in the Constitutional Convention was, how do we decide how we're going to be represented? And the Virginia plan, the big state said, we need representation based on population or even wealth. Meaning the more people that you had, the more people you should actually have representing you in Congress. Or the more wealth that you have, the more people you should have representing you in Congress. What was New Jersey about? And maybe this will help you out. Virginia plan, I had made the comment, size matters. That was kind of the Virginia plan. Go ahead.
Basically just 2 representatives to a state.
Equality. The small states had said, if you let the big states have the advantage like this, they're going to be able to swallow us whole. They're going to be able to outvote us on everything. 4 or 5 states out of the 13 might be able to make the decisions, and that's not fair. So ultimately what they came up with was the New Jersey plan, and the New Jersey plan was based on equality. Do you remember what the Virginia plan, what part of Congress the Virginia plan became? House of Representatives. And that means that the New Jersey plan became what? The United States Senate. And when they created the House and the Senate, what was that plan called? It would be Congress, but what was the plan? It was a different state. Not New Jersey, not Virginia, but Connecticut. The Connecticut plan dealt with that. What other questions have y'all got? Go ahead, yeah.
Can you break down the 3/5 compromise?
3/5 compromise. Anybody remember 3/5? Go ahead, Tony.
Slaves were 3/5 of a person.
Slaves were 3/5 of a person for what reason? Why would they be considered 3/5 of a person? Go ahead, Javier.
Because the South wanted the slaves to count as population, so that way they can have better representation.
Yeah,
The
go ahead.
North also didn't really agree with that, but they still wanted them to be people.
Wow, Javier, look at you go. Believe it or not, if you go back in time, and you hit this perfect. The South, in terms of slaves, and the North in terms of slaves, they wanted them to count as people when it served their interest, but it didn't always serve their interest. So the Southern states, when it came to representation in Congress, the Southern states said, look it, we want slaves to count as a full person so we get more seats. The Northern states didn't want them to count at all because they didn't have nearly as many slaves as the South. They didn't want to get punished over it. The compromise ultimately became the 3/5. 5 slaves equals 3 people, or a slave is 3/5 of a person. So yeah, the South was going to get a little bit more representation, but the North wasn't going to be at such a disadvantage. This was also for tax purposes, because taxes used to be paid on population. So the idea was that Northern states wanted slaves to count as people for tax purposes. Southern states didn't want them to count at all. Now it would be 3/5. So Southern states still had to pay more taxes. The North like that, but they didn't have to pay as much as if it was a full person. So the 3/5 idea was South is going to get more representation, the North or the federal government is going to get more taxation. What else have y'all got up here? Go ahead, Reed. Let's just talk about fractions in general, but we'll go ahead and start with the amendment fractions. What was the fraction that you needed in order to propose a constitutional amendment? Go ahead.
2/3.
2/3. You need a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate to propose a constitutional amendment. In order to ratify or pass that amendment, what fraction do you need? 3/4. You need a 3/4 vote of the states to ultimately ratify, which means what? If you had 13 states that said no, they could kill any constitutional amendment. What else was 2/3 that we talked about? 2/3 vote in order to propose an amendment, or a 2/3 vote to do what to the president? Override the veto. 2/3 vote to override a presidential veto. We've talked about 3/5. So 3/5, 2/3, 3/4. What was 9/13? Oh, 9 out of 13 states, or 69.2%, were required to ratify the original Constitution. Because if you remember, they knew that 9 states would say yes, and they feared that 4 would say no. What was 13/13? Oh, even Shaheb's right now. You know this is serious. What was 13/13?
All the states
To ratify what? Constitution was 9 out of 13. Not the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights led those other 4 states to say yes. 13 out of... What's that? What about the Articles of Confederation? You're right. 13 out of 13 to pass a law under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, it had to be unanimous. Yeah, I saw your hand.
Okay, the other 2/3, so over our president's veto, was that states or was that the House and Senate?
House and Senate, yes. House and Senate. What other questions have y'all got up here? Go ahead, Lex.
The Articles of Confederation, do you get to know like the first Continental Congress and the second one, or
No. The Continental Congresses were basically just from the reading quiz, so I wouldn't worry about those. And I don't have Articles of Confederation up here, but I do have articles in the Constitution. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is President, Article 3 is Courts, Article 4 was full faith and credit, Article 6, Supremacy Clause, Article 5 was amendments. So, and that would be really small. Go ahead, Tony.
What about ideology?
Don't worry about any of the ideology. I have not given you all the belief quiz yet, so do not worry about any of the ideology terms. What other questions do y'all have? Go ahead.
1808.
What was 1808? End of the slave trade. There were 3 provisions that we talked about that were in the original Constitution that dealt with slaves. One was the 3/5 clause, which said that 5 slaves equals 3 people for population, representation, taxation purposes. 1808 was the second one that we talked about. And you started it, Lex. What was the significance of this? What were they thinking they were going to do when they said 1808? Go ahead, Jefferson.
She was gonna talk. Why? That was when slave trade stopped, but supposedly they waited for 20 years, supposedly, to so no new slaves could enter.
Exactly, and this was the international slave trade. They could not they could not free the slaves because they would be taking away property, and they had just fought a war about, this idea of property. So what they ended up doing is they said, okay, we're going to ban the slave trade in 1808. We're going to give you 20 years. We know you southern states are kind of dependent upon this. We're going to give you 20 years to get off of it, and then at that point, the slaves will die off, and slavery will die its own natural death. What they ended up doing is it actually accelerated the number of slaves that came into the country. They started to breed slaves. They began to trade within the United States. So it actually made slavery, ironically, deeper into the country, if you will, than maybe had they not done this. Do you remember what the 3rd provision was? The 3rd provision. The Fugitive Slave Clause. Don't forget about the Fugitive Slave Clause, because that was in there. And when we talk about full faith and credit, you got a binding government document. Well, if you've got binding property and this property escapes from your state to a free state, that free state under the Fugitive Slave Clause was going to be bound to return that slave back to its rightful, or not necessarily rightful, but to return the slave back to its owner, at least in those times. Anything else that you got from chapter 2?
criminal searches?
Say what?
Criminal searches.
What were the searches that we talked about? Oh, did we talk about searches? Do you remember vomit?
Ew. Oh yeah.
What was the rule for vomit? Yeah, that's right. If it's an invasive search, they made him vomit against his will. They fished the morphine out of his vomit. They had a warrant for morphine. Court said, this shocks my conscience. You can't make somebody vomit against their will, fish through their vomit, and use that evidence against them. So we talked about the vomit example. I believe we talked about blood, too. Didn't some of y'all kill some cheating boyfriends? What was the blood on the nail rule?
That's good.
It's not.
Wow, that's good, Julia says, with a deadpan face. Zoom in on her right now. Let's make sure that this is online. What do you mean that's good, Julia?
Because if you willingly come in to, be questioned about, what happened, or not even questioned, just, to get information, and they notice that you have blood on your hand, they're allowed to be okay.
What was the difference between the blood on the hand and what was the difference between making the guy vomit?
Well, first off, the cops messed up, and they should have said that it was for, medical purposes, they were in fear of his life.
If you actually make somebody vomit and you say this is to save them as opposed to gain a criminal conviction, that actually is legal. That's really a nice catch. But what was the difference, though, between the blood on the nail? Go ahead, Gloria.
The lady wasn't under arrest. She went in there willingly. And the
She
guy,
did?
And the
Well,
Go ahead, Javante.
The blood was external, the drugs were internal.
It was external, and that's the other thing. It wasn't invasive because they could actually see it. And if you remember, and I'm not going to do this on camera, but if you remember, she was trying to destroy the evidence. And in this instance, A, she voluntarily went into the police station. B, that evidence was visible. It was not invasive. C, she was destroying the evidence. This is actually perfectly legal for the police to act. In fact, they're kind of required to. So kind of keep that in mind. The shot in the ass. Yeah, I'm saying this on camera now. Y'all remember that? Go ahead, Jab. You remember this?
No.
No. Anybody? Go ahead, Jefferson.
Cops can arrest someone, and if they get shot, it means a lethal wound. They can actually go and, prosecute them or something.
For the interest of saving, a life, they can. But